Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the age of stone corridors, candle smoke, and the faint scratch of quills on parchment. A time when a crown didn't guarantee a throne, but it might buy you a tiny stone cell next to a drafty chapel and a lifetime of plain porridge. So pull up the blankets, let the screen dim, and we'll wander gently through the lives of medieval queens who were politely, yet firmly, shown the convent door. Because nothing says, "Thank you for your years of dynastic service," like being told to pack one veil, one rosary, and absolutely no regalia. Let's begin with the basic premise. Medieval Europe loved locking inconvenient women in boxes, preferably boxes with a crucifix on top. If you were a queen who'd outlived your usefulness, or worse, outlived your king, you became a logistical problem. You couldn't legally reign in most places. Remarrying you would hand power to some new fellow, and leaving you loose at court-invited plots, poisons, and the occasional small coup. The tidy solution: pop you into a nunnery, slide the bolt, and let the abbess handle the paperwork. Monasteries doubled as retirement homes, witness protection programs, and very quiet prisons, all in one neat Benedictine package. Our first guest tonight is Queen Ingeborg of Denmark. Poor Ingeborg, whose marriage to Philip Roman II of France went so spectacularly wrong that historians still sigh when they see her name. The wedding took place in 1213, the annulment proceedings began about 15 minutes later, and Ingeborg spent the next 20-odd years being shuffled between castles like unwanted furniture. When Philip finally died, her stepson, eager to tidy the dynastic attic, suggested she might enjoy dedicating her life to prayer. Translation: please vanish, but spiritually. Ingeborg was shunted off to the Abbey of St. Jean-les-Pontois, where she was treated with the courtesy owed to a woman who had once been queen, which is to say they let her keep 2 servants and a slightly better mattress. She spent her days petitioning the Pope for money she was owed, composing letters no one answered, and presumably wondering how many Hail Marys equal 1 crown. She died in 1237, still technically queen, practically abbess in name only, and absolutely free of court gossip, because no one was listening. Let's drift over to the next royal fiasco, this time in England. Joan of Navarre, widow of Henry Roman IV, had the misfortune of outliving her husband and outliving her political welcome. Henry V, her stepson, fresh off victory at Agincourt, decided Joan was sitting on land he could use for giveaways to his buddies. Accusations of witchcraft arrived right on cue. Because of course they did. Nothing clears an inheritance faster than she turned the chamberlain into a frog. Joan was placed under house arrest, then gently escorted into Pevensey Castle, which doubled as a convenient coastal lock-up, and finally, when the paperwork got annoying, deposited at the Nunnery of Nottingham. There she remained for roughly 3 years, until the king remembered she had already signed everything over. Charges evaporated like morning dew, and Joan emerged, older, poorer, and conveniently pious. She lived out her days quietly, presumably counting the number of times, which rhymes with rich, and died with minimal fuss in 1437. One small mercy, at least they let her keep her own clothes. Usually. Now, a quick sensory pause so we can picture the scene. Most convents for ex-queens were not the bare-bones anchor holds of penitent hermits. They were comfortably dull. Think thick stone walls smothered in ivy, prayer bells every 8 hours, and meals that tasted like someone had whispered the word salt over the cauldron and moved on. Rooks cawed in the cloister garth, manuscripts dried in the sun, and somewhere a prioress practiced the disapproving sigh she'd need when the queen asked for wine that wasn't watered. Life moved at the speed of dripping wax. If you were used to jousts, hunts, and the occasional international summit, the silence itself became a second set of bars. Which brings us to perhaps the most famous convent casualty, Urraca of Leon and Castile. Except Urraca refused to be casualty of anything. She was widowed, threatened with a nunnery, and here's the twist, declared herself sovereign instead. The bishops panicked. Nobles fainted. Chronicles called her imperatrix, just to avoid admitting a woman held the imperial title outright. Urraca spent her reign fighting off cousins, ex-husbands, and the occasional pope, and she never once let anyone lock her behind cloister walls. She is, you might say, the queen who escaped the narrative entirely. We'll leave her galloping across Castile, because tonight's theme is the ones who didn't get away, and we need to keep the vibes sleepy, not revolutionary. Softly now, let's tiptoe north to Brabant and meet Margaret of England, daughter of Edward Roman III, married to a duke who died on crusade of dysentery. Naturally, crusading gastrointestinal tracts were notoriously unreliable. Margaret's brother, Richard Roman II, needed her dower lands for political poker. Solution: Margaret was invited very politely to choose a life of contemplation. She entered the convent of Fontenelle, took no formal vows, and spent the next decade acting as honorary abbess, which mostly meant signing charters she didn't raid and approving the purchase of more fish for Lent. She retained her own seal, a small household, and the right to receive visitors, provided the visitors weren't plotting anything more exciting than embroidery patterns. When she died, they buried her in grey habit with a silver crown on the tomb slab, just to confuse later tourists. A perfect medieval compromise, half queen, half cloister, all paperwork. Let's linger on that image a moment, the crown laid flat in stone, the veil stitched in effigy. Medieval sculptors loved dual iconography because it sold the myth that these women had freely exchanged worldly pomp for spiritual riches. In reality, most queens fought the transition with every notarized fiber of their being. They petitioned the Pope, bribed household officers, and occasionally escaped custody long enough to marry someone inconvenient, anything to avoid the cloister's final hush. But once the gate shut, resistance became a matter of internal monologue. Days dissolved into liturgical hours. You could own nothing, yet be owned by everything: the rule, the order, the memory of a coronation that now felt like someone else's bedtime story. And so the candle gutters, the bell rings for nocturnes, and our first part drifts to its own quiet close. When we return, we'll watch a German empress barter an entire duchy for the right to stay out of the nunnery, and we'll meet a Scottish queen who turned her convent into a miniature court, complete with imported musicians and the occasional pet monkey. Until then, let the scent of old cardamom linger. Let the draught from the cloister corridor settle round your shoulders like a stole, and imagine the soft click of a latch that opens only one way. Our next visitor is Empress Beatrice of Hohenstaufen, queen in her own right of Sicily, widow of the emperor who'd owned half the map, and, if her male relatives had their way, future abbess of a quiet Swabian house famous for its herb garden and its total absence of politics. Beatrice listened to the proposal, yawned, and promptly mortgaged 3 alpine towns so she could hire lawyers to shout "absolutely not" in 4 languages. She won. The convent gate stayed shut. She stayed out. Medieval Europe called it a scandal. Beatrice called it Tuesday. The trick, she discovered, was to make yourself more inconvenient outside than inside. She threatened to remarry a rival house, hinted at foreign alliances, and best of all, reminded the Pope that her dower portfolio included half the roads pilgrims needed to reach Rome. Nothing motivates a papal exemption like the prospect of toll booths on the Via Francigena. So Beatrice kept her lands, her title, and her own front door key. She died in her palazzo at 58, surrounded by ledgers instead of nuns, proving that sometimes the safest prison is the one you refuse to enter. Meanwhile, further north, Queen Margaret of Scotland, widow of King Alexander Roman III, was discovering the softer cushions of captivity. After Alexander tumbled off a cliff during a midnight fog, because of course he did. Scottish weather is a character in every chronicle. The nobles needed Margaret off the chessboard before she married someone with an army. They suggested the Nunnery of Coldstream, famous for brisk breezes and absolutely no political intrigue. Margaret packed 3 trunks of gowns, imported Flemish lutanists, and a small monkey trained to steal rosaries. Within a month, the cloister echoed with secular songs. The abbess was tipsy on Bordeaux, and the prior had learned to juggle. Margaret's reign in miniature lasted 4 pleasant years until the Regency decided she was more expensive inside than out. They restored her income, moved her to a riverside manor, and quietly asked the monkey to leave. Another quiet victory, the queen who turned convent into court and left before the bell could toll her name. Let's linger on that monkey a moment. Tiny, capricious, indifferent to salvation. Monkeys pop up surprisingly often in cloistered queen stories. Perhaps because primates understand cages, perhaps because they look adorable clutching a crucifix. Whatever the reason, medieval accounts love mentioning them. The queen's pet squirrel, the duchess's parrot who could recite the Paternoster backwards. These creatures serve as living reminders that the women themselves had once been exotic imports, decorative, chatty, and now confined for the moral safety of everyone else. When the animal leaves, the metaphor stays. But not every queen kept her sense of humor. Take poor Blanche of Artois, Queen of Navarre, widow at 26, regent for her infant son, and therefore dangerous. The French court suggested she retire for spiritual refreshment at the Abbey of Maubuisson. Blanche obeyed, but she also stopped speaking. For an entire year, she communicated only by gesture, leaving the nuns to interpret elaborate shrugs and the occasional raised eyebrow. Historians call it a protest. The abbess called it penance. Her confessor wrote that silence might purge pride. Blanche probably hoped it would drive everyone else insane. Eventually, the king offered her a pension increase if she would just say "Amen" at meals. She did, once, and spent the rest of her life speaking only in whispers, as though the convent itself were a sick child that needed soothing. She died at 60, voice soft as dust, proving you can refuse people even the sound of your rebellion. Let's drift down the corridor to Burgundy, where Queen Joan the Lame, yes, medieval nicknames were brutal, faced a different dilemma. She wished to enter religion voluntarily, but her husband, Philip VI, needed her signature on several land transfers first. Joan agreed, provided she could found her own house under strict Clarison rules, poverty, charity, and absolutely no aristocratic visitors who might remind her of court gossip. The result was the Abbey of St. Benoit-sur-Loire, where Joan limped through cloisters she'd paid for herself, wrapped in homespun, still queenly in posture if not in fabric. She died before the building was finished, leaving instructions that her tombstone read simply, Joan, Nun. No title, no crown, no date. Even in death, she negotiated anonymity, an ex-queen who finally achieved invisibility on her own terms. Feel the temperature drop as night deepens. The prayer bell has already tolled compline. The last candle spits a tiny shard of gold onto the scriptorium floor. Imagine the faint creak of a door that only abbesses open, the rustle of a silk girdle secretly kept, just in case. Our walk isn't over. Ahead wait Portuguese infantas, Italian duchesses, and one Spanish queen who taught her parrot to scream Libera Nas every time the bishop entered. For now, let the hush settle. Let the chill of stone reach your fingertips so you can better understand the weight of a crown once placed, and then quietly locked away. Our next companion is Infanta Branca of Portugal, daughter of King Sancho I, nicknamed the Pious, though no one ever called her that. At 17, she was informed that the dynasty had run out of dowry funds and, more importantly, run out of eligible princes who weren't cousins. The solution: bundle her off to the Cistercian Abbey of Lorvau, where her aunt already served as abbess, thus keeping the bloodline and its increasingly fragile chromosomes safely in-house. Branca obeyed, but she brought luggage, 6 trunks of brocade, a troubadour who specialized in sad songs, and a small orchestra of vihuelas. The monks across the valley complained about the noise. The abbess complained about the laundry bill. Branca herself complained about nothing at all. She simply stopped getting out of bed for lauds. For 3 weeks, she lay staring at the ceiling, whispering the lyrics of courtly love poems until the novices learned them by heart. Eventually, the Pope sent a legate to inquire whether she had taken valid vows or was simply napping in religion. Branca answered by sitting up, signing the charter with a flourish, and then, according to the chronicle, weeping so gently that her tears fell without sound, like dew on marble. She lived another 40 years, composed a hymnal still sung in Portugal, and never once referred to herself as Infanta again. The crown, she told a novice, was a circlet of iron that learns to rust in silence. Feel the weight of that rust settling on your own eyelids. From Portugal, we float gently north to Savoy, where Queen Anne of Cyprus, yes, the island, the one everyone fought over, found herself widowed at 24 with a toddler who technically wore the crown but couldn't yet pronounce regency. Anne's cousins, the Savoyard counts, feared she might remarry a rival house and hand Cyprus to someone who owned better ships. Their solution: a priory high in the Alps, reachable only by mule in good weather. Anne requested one concession: she would enter as a lay sister, not a choir nun, thus keeping her personal income and, crucially, her Italian chef. The prior agreed. Mountain fare was bland even by monastic standards, and for the next decade, the cloister smelled of rosemary, citrus, and the faint panic of mules carrying fresh fish up switchbacks. Anne attended matins when she felt like it, hired tutors for her boy king who visited summers, and quietly financed Savoy's first public library. She died at 50, surrounded by ledgers and recipe scrolls, proving that if you must be imprisoned, you might as well cater the sentence. Notice how each woman negotiates the silence. Some compose music, some compose menus, all compose an interior life large enough to drown the echo of locked gates. The walls are thick, but the mind is a migratory bird that refuses passports. Now, let's tiptoe into Aragon, where Queen Leonor, consort of King James I, was retired to the Abbey of Santa Maria de Signa after producing 6 children and surviving 2 stillborn treaties. Leonor's husband, busy conquering Valencia, simply forgot to visit for 7 consecutive years. When he finally remembered her existence, he sent a herald to ask whether she'd mind taking the veil so he could stop pretending to be a widower. Leonor replied, through clenched teeth, that she would accept provided she could bring her pet gyrfalcon and a team of scribes. The abbey, dazzled by royal donations, agreed. Inside the cloister, Lena trained the falcon to perch on the refectory lectern during readings, ensuring every novice pronounced Latin vowels with crisp terror. She also commissioned a lavish chronicle of Aragonese conquests, inserting herself into every other chapter, usually handing swords to knights who historically never met her. Thus she rewrote her absence into presence, a ghost editor of the kingdom she had once ornamented. When she died, the falcon was buried in the cloister garden under a stone that reads, "Here lies loyalty, winged and unvanquished." Even now, local legend claims a shadow circles the ruins at dusk, screeching in perfect ecclesiastical Latin. Feel the mountain air thin ever so slightly. Your own breath slows to match the measured cadence of vespers sung 4 centuries ago. Imagine fingertips brushing rough stone, tracing the groove where someone etched a tiny crown before thinking better of it. The day's heat leaches away. Night settles like a veil woven of incense and distant sea salt. Ahead waits a French queen who tried to tunnel out of her abbey with a dessert spoon, and a Bohemian duchess who taught the cellar cat to carry letters in its collar. For now, let the bell toll once more, a low bronze murmur that asks nothing of you except the gentle surrender of wakefulness. We'll walk on when you're ready. No hurry, no plot, only the soft shuffle of slippers on flagstones and the faint, stubborn rust of crowns learning to sleep. Our next resident is Queen Marie of Anjou, consort to Charles VII. Yes, the one who owed Joan of Arc a thank-you note. Marie spent most of her marriage pregnant, praying, and pretending her husband's mistress was simply very devoted to horticulture. When Charles died, the new Dauphin, Louis, later nicknamed the Universal Spider for his intricate plots, decided mother's lands would make excellent glue for royal alliances. His method? A tasteful suggestion that Marie withdraw for the good of her soul. Marie, 53, arthritic and famously fond of almond custard, was installed at the Abbey of St. Antoine des Champs. The place was famous for strict silence and even stricter desserts, an unfortunate pairing if you enjoy gossip with your pastry. Within a month, Marie had confiscated 12 silver spoons from the refectory, claiming they felt lighter in her arthritic grip. She spent nights scratching at the mortar beneath her bed, spoon by spoon, humming lullabies to fool passing lay sisters. The plan, apparently, was to reach the river, flag a barge, and float to Provence where her nephew owed her a favor. Progress was slow. After a year, she had removed roughly 1 brick. The abbess discovered the cavity when a sleepy novice tripped over a loose paving stone and landed nose first in the queen's hoard of bent cutlery. Marie's punishment was pastoral rather than punitive. Extra embroidery duty and compulsory attendance at every single office. She responded by embroidering the entire Book of Ruth onto one altar cloth, inserting her own initials next to the phrase, "Whither thou goest, I will go," which most people took as piety and which the novices suspected was a threat. She died at 71, spoon count reduced to 0, tunnel filled with quicklime, but the altar cloth still hangs in the choir, an inadvertent map of stubborn patience. If you squint, you can see tiny pickaxes disguised as wheat sheaves. Even in captivity, the queen left coordinates. Let's drift northeast now to Bohemia, where Duchess Puchta of Rauschenberg, nicknamed the Lady of the Letters, was dispatched to the cloister of St. George at Prague Castle. Her crime? Objecting when her brother promised her inheritance to the Hussites, who had inconvenient theological objections to elaborate gowns. Puchta's solution was correspondence. She taught the abbey's cellar cat to wear a collar lined with parchment scraps. Each night the animal slipped through a loose grill, padded down the hill to the Rajenburg townhouse, and returned with replies tucked under velvet ribbon. The system worked for almost 2 years, until the cat developed a taste for trout and started making unscheduled stops at the fish market, where locals wondered why a feline wore jewelry. Eventually, the collar was confiscated. Puchta was moved to a more remote house where even cats feared to tread. Undaunted, she bribed a deaf lay brother to carry verbal messages, simple sentences memorized phonetically. Unfortunately, the brother's Latin was worse than his hearing. One heartfelt plea for legal aid arrived as the duck demands a larger orchard, which confused everyone except the orchard keeper, who assumed it was code for back taxes. Puchta died before rescue materialized, but her letters, collected centuries later, reveal a woman who refused to let walls dictate syllables. Language, like birds, ignores gates. Softly now, let's coast across the Channel to England, where Queen Joanna of Navarre, stepmother to Henry V, was accused of necromancy, a charge that carried the death penalty unless, of course, you were royal and willing to disappear. Henry, busy invading France, commuted the sentence to comfortable confinement at the Abbey of Pevensey. Yes, the same coastal fortress that once housed Blanche. These places recycled queens the way they recycled tapestries. Joanna, 65 and fond of astronomy, requested her astrolabe and a south-facing cell. The constable agreed, thinking navigation equipment harmless. He had not considered tides. Joanna spent 3 years calculating lunar tables so precise that local sailors began consulting the Witch of Pevensey before risking the Channel. Her charts, smuggled out under cloak of darkness, shortened sea routes and saved lives, ironically boosting the very navy that kept her locked away. Eventually, the king, informed that his stepmother was aiding maritime efficiency, decided prophecy looked better on parchment than on a pyre. He released her with a pension and a polite request that she stop predicting storms that delayed his armies. Joanna lived out her days in Kent, surrounded by star charts and the faint smell of seaweed. Even under house arrest, she realigned the world's compass. Feel the rhythm settle, spoon scrape, cat purr, astrolabe click. Each sound is tiny, almost lullaby soft, yet each chips at the mortar of inevitability. The night deepens. The candle stub gutters, releasing a ribbon of smoke that curls like a question mark. Somewhere a nun snores gently, a queen turns her pillow, and the bell ringer miscounts the strokes. 9 instead of 8, because even time grows drowsy. Ahead waits a Castilian princess who rewrote convent rules to include salsa verde, and a Hungarian queen who taught the novices fencing with embroidery hoops. But for now, let the hush pool around your shoulders. Imagine the chill of damp stone warming under steady breath, the faint taste of almond still clinging to an old queen's fingertips. We'll amble onward when you're ready. No sudden movements, no startling revelations, just the slow erosion of walls by whisper, spoon, and starlight. Let's shuffle a little further, past the fish-smelling Seine, until the night air carries garlic and the faint sting of vinegar. We're in 15th century Castile, in the hill-cooled abbey of Los Huelgas, part convent, part royal guest house, and for a brief window, the unofficial test kitchen of Infanta Constanza. She arrived widowed, childless, and more scandalously, accompanied by her private cook, Pedro, whose family had been perfecting salsa verde since the Reconquista was a toddler. The abbess protested, "Cloisters do not smell of onions." Constanza answered that humility begins with good seasoning, and Pedro was therefore a spiritual necessity. Within weeks, novices who had never tasted anything sharper than unsalted gruel were sneaking into the refectory clutching hand painted recipe cards. The infirmarian reported a suspicious rise in joyful palpitations, which she blamed on capers. Constanza herself presided over the mortar, grinding parsley, anchovy, and bread-soaked vinegar while murmuring Psalm 23, presumably because "my cup runneth over" covers sauce drips. When the bishop arrived for inspection, the abbess served him plain boiled cod. Constanza sent a side bowl of green brightness. He ate, sighed, and quietly doubled the convent's fish allowance. Spice, it seems, can purchase indulgence more effectively than coin. Constanza died at 71, having taken full vows, but her mortuary roll lists among her relics a wooden spoon, well licked. If you wander Las Hulgas at dusk, guides still point to a faded green splash on the sacristy wall, ghost of a sauce that refused to be silent. Let's drift east now, to the Hungarian marches, where Queen Beatrice of Luxembourg, teenage bride, teenage widow, and full-time political loose end, was escorted to the Dominican nunnery of Terce. The house stood on a cliff above the Danube, winds so brisk they could slice onions without assistance. Beatrice, restless and fond of movement, found the schedule of 8 daily offices intolerably still. Her solution: fencing, not with rapiers, those were frowned upon, but with embroidery hoops tightened till the rims resembled bucklers. She and the novices would parry, thrust, and riposte down the cloister, chanting footwork in Latin, Advoco, Repello, Gloria. The prioress objected until she noticed the girl's needlework improved. Apparently a firm wrist aids tiny stitches. Beatrice also introduced the concept of target practice, hurling dried chickpeas at a tapestry of the 7 deadly sins. Pride took the most hits. Sloth was largely spared, out of professional courtesy. When the provincial father visited, he found the community flushed, breathless, and inexplicably accurate with legumes. Rather than condemn the exercise, he requested they demonstrate at the next ecclesiastical synod. Proof, he claimed, that devotion could coexist with cardiovascular health. Beatrice lived another 30 years, never managed to tunnel out, but left behind the best documented biceps in medieval Hungary and a chickpea-shaped dent in pride that still shows on the tapestry if the guide angles the lamp just so. Softly now, let's coast back to France. Because of course we must. The French perfected the art of gilded incarceration. There, in the Abbey of Fontevraud, lies the tale of Elena of Brittany, cousin to the crown, potential heiress, and therefore permanent problem. After her brother Arthur vanished, allegedly at King John's hand, Elena spent her entire adult life under various forms of house arrest. Fontevraud was merely the final address, a Plantagenet pension plan with vines. She entered at 38, silver streaking her dark plate, and proceeded to redecorate. Elena commissioned stained glass windows, illustrating not biblical scenes, but the genealogy of Brittany, subtly inserting her own claim at every 3rd panel. Monks who glanced up during matins found themselves reading a political manifesto in primary colors. The abbess, politically astute, pretended not to notice. Instead, she charged pilgrims an extra denier to view the windows of royal humility, thereby doubling convent income. Elena also established a scriptorium dedicated to Breton chronicles, ensuring copyists preserved versions where English kings appeared footnoted and dubious. She died at 57, having spent 4 decades behind stone, yet her windows still cast blue light on the altar each sunrise, an argument you cannot imprison if the story keeps climbing out. Feel the hush thicken again. The night's chill settles like a hand on your shoulder, gentle, insistent. Imagine distant Danube wind slipping through arrow slits, carrying the faint clack of hoop against hoop. Somewhere a ladle scrapes the last emerald streak of sauce from a bowl. Somewhere a chickpea rolls to a stop against humility's woven toe. These are not rebellions that shake kingdoms. They are rustlings at the edge of obedience, soft as breath, yet they keep the heart beating in regulated cages. A head wait, an English queen who taught the nuns to play chess with living novices as pieces, and a Swedish princess who replaced the convent bell with tuned cowries, so the hours chimed in harmony with seabirds. But for now, let your own breathing slow to the cadence of embroidered footfalls. Let the scent of garlic and parsley fade into something milder, almost like candle smoke. We'll meander onward when you're ready. No sudden clang of portcullis, only the steady, seasoning drip of minutes learning to taste like freedom. Let's glide on velvet-slippered feet into early 15th century England, where the night smells of wet wool and the faintest hint of ink. Our hostess is Queen Joan of Navarre. Again, yes, she's the gift that keeps on giving. Who, after her little astrolabe and tides incident, was moved inland to the Abbey of Amesbury. The place was spacious, ancient, and regrettably short of entertainment. Joan's solution: living chess. She coaxed the novices into sewing oversized white and black veils, then assigned each girl a square in the cloister garth. Moves were called in French, the only language Joan admitted could sound polite while ordering people to march into mortal danger. The abbess protested that chess encouraged strategic pride. Joan replied humility also required knowing when to sacrifice. And anyway, the garden paths already looked like a grid, so Providence clearly approved. Games lasted days, pawns advanced at terce, bishops swept in at vespers, and the queen, played by the tallest novice, glided only under skies she personally deemed sufficiently dramatic. When the Bishop of Salisbury visited, he found 30 nuns frozen mid-board, veils flapping like pennants. He watched for an hour, forgot to scold, and later requested a miniature set be painted in his breviary, proof that even prelates crave a glimpse of calculated rebellion. Joan died at 67, having never lost a match. Her epitaph reads simply, "She played." If you wander Amesbury at dusk, guides still point out faded paving stones labeled a 4, C7, ghost squares no grass will cover. Let's drift north now, across the chill North Sea to the Swedish island of Öland. Their princess Ingeborg. Yet another Ingeborg, medieval Europe was nothing if not repetitive, was deposited at the convent of Borgholm after her husband, a Danish duke, remembered he preferred someone younger and more Danish. The abbey bell, cracked during a storm, tolled flat and mournful, scattering gulls and novices alike. Ingeborg, whose childhood had been lulled by her mother's tuned cowrie shells from Gotland, requested permission to recast the bell. The prioress, tone-deaf and tight-fisted, refused. Ingeborg's response was subtle. She collected every shell washed ashore, drilled tiny holes, and hung them along the cloister arcade. When Baltic winds rushed through, the shells knocked together, chiming a soft pentatonic scale that made the broken bell sound barbaric. Novices began oversleeping, lulled by the new lullaby, and the prioress found herself pacing to a rhythm not her own. Eventually she capitulated, allowed the recasting, but kept the cowrie curtain, double tolling, shell and bronze in gentle discord. Ingeborg died at 51, presumably comforted that time itself now rang in two voices, one of authority, one of waves. Feel the cadence settle again, clack of chess commands fading into glassy shell music, both softer than the heartbeat yet oddly persistent. These women aren't escaping. They're retuning the prison frequency so the walls vibrate at a pitch they can tolerate. Now, let's coast back to Burgundy, to the Abbey of Pont aux Dames, where Queen Isabel of Portugal, consort to Duke Philip the Good, voluntarily retired after producing 3 heirs, and surviving one too many banquets featuring swans stuffed with peacocks stuffed with partridge, because of course they were. Isabel entered cloister at 45, declaring she wished to prepare the soul without preparing the palate. She immediately abolished fish-only Fridays and introduced salad. The cellarer protested greens were suspiciously Roman. Isabel replied that humility meant chewing what you grow, and anyway lettuce never plotted against the Pope. She also instituted silent strolls, no talking, just slow circuits of the herb garden while contemplating mortality and the proper way to thin carrots. Novices discovered that enforced quiet made their thoughts impossibly loud. Several asked to extend the walks purely to finish arguments with themselves. Isabel died at 60, reportedly murmuring "dress the salad lightly," which the nuns mistook for spiritual metaphor and which the cook, sensibly, took literally. The abbey still serves vinaigrette every Friday, a gentle rebellion against centuries of compulsory card. Night deepens. The candle stub bows lower, pooling liquid wax like tiny molten crowns. Imagine the hush of chess pieces toppling one by one, the faint rustle of cowrie strings stirred by a draught you can't feel. These queens inch across the board of their captivity, never declaring checkmate, yet rearranging the squares until the game belongs to them. A headweight, a Spanish queen who turned the laundry into a scriptorium using only charcoal and bed linen, and a Scottish duchess who taught the convent goat to bleat the hours in a proximate Gregorian chant. But for now, let your own thoughts walk slowly from square to square, pausing where the grass refuses to grow. Let the vinaigrette settle on your tongue, mild, acidic, barely there, like freedom when it's tasted in very small doses. We'll drift onward when you're ready. No rush, no capture, only the hushed certainty that every wall, sooner or later, learns the shape of what leans against it. Let's drift south again, until the air smells of sun-washed linen and the faint, metallic tang of charcoal. We arrive at the Abbey of Santa Maria la Real in Burgos, where Queen Catalina of Lancaster, English by birth, Castilian by marriage, was politely incarcerated after her husband died, and the Regency decided her presence complicated council arithmetic. Catalina arrived with a single trunk, no gowns, no jewels, only broken pieces of willow charcoal wrapped in wool. The abbess assumed she planned to draw devotional images. Instead, Catalina commandeered the laundry terrace. On wash days, while sheets billowed like ghost sails, she sketched chronicles onto the damp fabric, whole scenes of court intrigue, marriage negotiations, and discreetly the faces of men who'd signed her exile. Ink wouldn't adhere to linen. Charcoal did, at least until the next rainfall. The laundresses became her first readership, pointing out smudged details while wrapping wet sheets around their arms. One novice, assigned to fold, noticed the same bishop appearing in every margin with a donkey's ears. She giggled. Giggles are currency in cloisters. Word spread. Pilgrims began requesting the Queen's laundry as souvenirs. The abbess, mortified, tried to confiscate the lot. Catalina responded by switching to night work, pinning sheets to the inside of the cloister arcade, sketching by moonlight. Each dawn the images faded, but the impression lingered, an entire history lesson you could shake crumbs from. She died at 59, leaving no formal manuscripts, yet local records note a sudden spike in literate laundresses for the next 3 generations. Sometimes the deepest archive is fabric softener. Let's glide northwest now to the Scottish borders, where Duchess Margaret of Gelders, widow of the Earl of Moray, was encouraged to take spiritual refuge at the Cistercian house of Melrose. Margaret, a woman who could read Latin but preferred animal husbandry, arrived with a goat. Not a dainty lap goat, a large, opinionated creature named Brutus, who had once eaten a papal bull, the document, not the animal, though he would have. The abbey kept sheep for wool. Margaret argued goats were more ecumenical, since they eat anything and therefore symbolize humility. The cellarer, eyeing his vegetable patch, was unconvinced. Within weeks, Brutus had learned to mimic the bell ringer's cadence. Each office, the goat waited until the bronze finished tolling, then bleated a wavering echo that managed to be both off-key and devotional. Novices began timing their responses to Brutus rather than the bell, resulting in a gentle, goat-shaped liturgical lag. The abbot complained the service sounded caprine. Margaret replied that David played harp to sheep. Why shouldn't Scotland sing to goats? Eventually, the house capitulated, allowing Brutus to lead processions provided he wore a harness of plain sackcloth. Pilgrims came for healing. They left with cheese and the vague sense they'd attended vespers conducted by a livestock soloist. Margaret died at 67. Brutus lived another decade, bleating the hours faithfully, even when his voice cracked into a croak. The monks buried him in the orchard, where, local legend claims, every spring a newborn kid appears, attempts one broken Gregorian note, then trots away, duty done. Feel the tempo soften again, the faint scrape of charcoal on damp linen, the woolly vibrato of a goat who thinks he's a cantor. These are not grand rebellions, no banners, no beheadings, just the low-grade hum of personalities refusing to be ironed flat. Now, let's coast toward the Low Countries, to the Abbey of Forest, where Countess Jean of Brabant, left politically homeless after her husband gambled away 3 provinces, requested admission, only if I may keep my lute strings silk, not gut. The abbess, herself a former trover, agreed, and soon the cloister echoed with plucked thirds and sixths, intervals the older nuns called lascivious, but hummed in the bathhouse. Jean composed a cycle of songs titled The Hours in Disguise, each office camouflaged as a love ballad. Matins became Awake, My Dove, sext, The sun burns upon your shoulder, compline, Fold your wings, my heart. Outsiders heard devotion, insiders heard timetable. The music spread to parish churches. Priests complained the faithful lingered after Mass, hoping for an encore. Jean died at 55, her lute interred with her, strings still warm. The Abbey Chronicle notes laconically, she kept time, and let time keep her. If you stand outside the ruins at twilight, wind sometimes snaps the wild clematis against stone in exactly those chord progressions, an accidental recital for anyone drowsy enough to listen. Night settles deeper. The candle gives one last splutter, a tiny crunch of wick like distant footsteps on gravel. Imagine linen flapping half dry, the ghost of charcoal smudging your fingertips, a goat croak drifting over apple boughs. These queens tweak the fabric of confinement until it resembles something they can wear. An altered seam here, a hidden pleat there. never escaping the garment, but making it fit badly enough to remind everyone it was stitched by someone else. A head-weight an Austrian archduchess who taught the convent geese to march in formation, and a Sicilian queen who dyed the habits saffron because even penance should feel like sunrise. But for now, let your own pulse slow to the cadence of fading bleats and half-remembered chords. Let the scent of damp cloth mingle with night air, cool, slightly acrid, barely there, like history when it exhales. We'll drift onward when you're ready, no sudden drumbeats, only the gentle suspicion that every wall, given long enough, learns to echo the last voice that leaned against it. Still with me? Good. Let's glide eastward until the night air smells of pine sap and the faint, buttery bloom of saffron. First stop, the Austrian Tyrol, where Archduchess Magdalena, spare princess, spinster at 26, was deposited at the cloister of Hall in 1495. The house was famous for two things: immaculate manuscripts and militant geese who patrolled the yard like feathered sergeants. Magdalena, raised on military camps and the distant thud of pike drills, felt instantly at home. She noticed the geese responded to her whistle. Within a month, they were parading in V formation behind her, wings flapping in something approximating step. The abbess complained that birds should not imitate empire. Magdalena replied that geese saved Rome once, so Austria could hardly object. She taught them to halt at the bell, to advance at a second whistle, and, her masterpiece, to stand semi-circle around anyone arriving after hours, honking the first line of Salve Regina in goose accent. Novices began scheduling tardy returns just to experience the choir. Pilgrims assumed the display was miraculous. Donations rose. When Magdalena died at 54, the community erected a small stone goose, wings half raised above the gate. Every spring, without human prompting, the resident flock still forms a ragged V and waddles to the same spot, waiting for a whistle that no longer comes. Even discipline, it seems, can mellow into lullaby. Let's drift south now, across the moonlit Strait of Messina, to the Benedictine house of San Luca in Palermo. There we meet Queen Sybil of Acera, consort to the ever-scheming King Tancred of Sicily, who found herself surplus inventory after her husband's death and her stepson's noisy coronation. The new regime suggested a life of contemplation. Sybil requested one concession: the right to keep her saffron stores, because even repentance should arrive in color. The abbey, fond of golden illuminations, agreed, imagining discreet pigment for manuscripts. Sybil had grander plans. First, she diluted the dye and soaked the community's habits, turning the entire choir sunrise orange. The bishop arrived for consecration, blinked twice, and declared the shade miraculously Iberian, which was code for I give up. Next, Sybil tinted the altar cloths, then the table linens, until the interior glowed like perpetual dawn. Novices claimed the color improved their mood. The infirmarian reported fewer winter chills. Modern chemists might credit Crossin's mild antidepressant properties. The nuns credited divine optimism. Sybil died at 62, was buried in regulation grey, but the habits remained saffron for another century, fading slowly into buttercup, then cream, then memory. If you visit at sunrise, the walls still blush faint apricot, an echo of a queen who refused to let penance look like dusk. Feel the pace flatten even further, the soft slap of goose feet on damp flagstones, the slow bleed of saffron into linen, both gentler than breath, yet oddly persistent. These women tint the fabric of confinement until the cage itself begins to resemble sunrise. Now, let's coast toward the Low Countries again. Because they specialize in damp patience, to the Abbey of La Ramée, where Countess Elizabeth of Nassau, left husbandless, land-rich, and politically awkward, requested admission, provided I may keep my canaries. The prioress, imagining a modest cage, agreed. Elizabeth arrived with 40 birds, trilling a chromatic scale that made the chapel organ sound arthritic. Within weeks, she had trained them to flutter overhead during offices, each bird releasing a single down feather at the sanctus, creating a slow, yellow snowfall of devotion. The feathers were collected, stitched into tiny quilts for the poor, and sold to pilgrims as soufflés of the seraphim. The prior complained the choir sounded like a vineyard at harvest. Elizabeth answered that David praised with strings, Nassau preferred wings. She died at 58, the canaries were freed, but local sparrows adopted the habit, and even now, if you attend early mass, you may feel a stray feather drift onto your shoulder, an airy benediction from a queen who taught captivity to sing. Night leans in, almost weightless. The candle is now a pale blue thread, its glow no wider than a saffron stigma. Imagine goose honks softening into distant lullaby, canary feathers settling like slow snow. These queens adjust the acoustics of imprisonment until the echo sounds almost like welcome. A head wait, a Danish queen who knitted her own escape route, literally in wool, and a Bavarian princess who replaced the grill with mirrors so the nuns could watch themselves pray. But for now, let your own eyelids droop to the cadence of marching birds and yellow snowfall. Let the scent of pine and crocus drift away, cool, powdery, barely noticeable, like freedom when it arrives in color rather than contour. We'll drift onward when you're ready, no harsh bells, only the faint, persistent honk of history learning to keep time with your breathing. Still hovering on the edge of sleep. Perfect. Let's slip north, where the night air smells of sheep damp wool and the faint metallic chill of mirrored glass. First stop, the Abbey of St. Agnet in Roskilde, Denmark. Low stone corridors, herring in the refectory, and a perpetual draught that hums like a lullaby off the fjord. Our guest is Queen Dorothea of Brandenburg, dumped there at 41 after her nephew consolidated the throne and decided aunties were excess furniture. Dorothea, practical and fond of needlework, brought no luggage except several miles of undyed wool and needles carved from driftwood. The abbess assumed she planned mittens for the poor. Dorothea planned a rope. For 3 years she knitted in the twilight hour between compline and matins. Plain garter stitch, 6 stitches wide, length accumulating under her cart like a sleepy snake. She told curious novices it was a scarf for winter sermons, which technically was true. She simply omitted that the sermon would be delivered elsewhere. While knitting, she hummed the psalm tone associated with Psalm 124. Our soul is escaped as a bird out of the snare of the fowlers. The novices joined the hum, unaware they were providing cover noise for counting rows. When the blanket cord reached 60 ells, Dorothea weighted one end with her iron prayer book stand, flung it from a garderobe window during a March gale, and abseiled into the herb garden. The wool stretched, held, and even provided a soft landing on the thyme bed, proof that natural fibers care about dignity. She was recaptured within a day. Denmark is, after all, mostly coastline, but the escape became local legend, and the abbey gained the nickname, the house Our Lady knitted. Dorothea lived another 20 years, calmly spinning more wool, this time actually knitting mittens. If you visit Roskilde, guides will show you a weather pale coil labeled the first scarf, though it looks suspiciously sturdy for neckwear. Touch it and you'll feel the faint elasticity of hope, still forgiving under pressure. Let's drift southwest now to the Bavarian foothills, where Princess Kunigund of Hohenlohe, politically orphaned, militarily irrelevant, was guided to the cloister of Hohenfurth. The house observed strict enclosure. A barred grille separated visitors from nuns, allowing only voices and fingertips to brush air. Kunigund, who had grown up admiring her own reflection in polished armor, found the barrier psychologically claustrophobic. Her solution? Mirrors. She requested small looking glasses, ostensibly to examine conscience-struck faces during confession, and installed them on the inner side of the grille. The effect was subtle but disorienting. Visitors now saw themselves, not the nuns, when they leaned in to speak. Pilgrims who came seeking intercession found their own blemishes, beards, or anxious eyes staring back. Many shortened their petitions, some apologized to their own reflections, and left in thoughtful silence. The abbess, noticing a drop in frivolous calls, praised Kunigund's innovation as a practical mortification. Inside the cloister, the nuns could watch the world watch itself, an inversion of surveillance that granted them quiet anonymity. Kunigund died at 57, mirrors willed to the community. They remained in place for 2 centuries, quietly teaching outsiders to confront the person they most wanted to leave behind. Even now, if you peer through the rusted grille, you may catch your own silhouette caught in a tarnished shard. An unsolicited examination of conscience, delivered by a princess who preferred being unseen. Feel the rhythm soften, the soft click of needles in wool, the hush of someone recognizing their own face and falling silent. These queens rearrange the optics of captivity until the cage begins to reflect the watcher rather than the watched. Now, let's coast toward the Auvergne to the Abbey of Moutier-d'Arhun, where Countess Alix of Clermont, widowed, land-rich, and inconvenient, was invited to rest her spirit. Alix requested the right to keep pigeons, claiming homing birds aided prayer by reminding souls of ascent. The prior, imagining a modest dovecote, agreed. Alix arrived with 30 birds and a plan. Each pigeon carried a single bead sewn into a leg ribbon, amber for land petitions, coral for marriage pleas, plain wood for remember me. Released on Sundays, they fluttered to relatives, lawyers, and occasionally the king's falconer. Returns were mixed. Some birds defected to warmer rooftops. But several arrived punctually, ribbons swapped for signed exemptions or sympathetic replies. The prior complained the cloister resembled a post office. Alix answered that the Holy Ghost descended as a dove. Why not Federal Express? She died at 61, having secured reduced dowry taxes for every niece and a papal dispensation for a nephew who wanted to marry his step-cousin. Exactly the sort of not medieval families prized. The pigeons were served at her funeral feast, the ones that failed to return anyway. A practicality Alix would have appreciated. Why let symbolism go cold? If you visit Arhun, the dovecote still stands, empty, wind whistling through holes that once carried beads and hope across mountain air. Night leans in, almost weightless. The candle is now a bruise-colored smudge, its heat no broader than a knitted loop. Imagine wool stretching then forgiving, mirrors fogging with your own breath, pigeon wings brushing the bell tower once before disappearing into starlight. These women loosen the seams of enclosure until the stitches resemble sky, full of exits too soft to notice. Ahead waits an English duchess who taught the nuns Morris dancing with handkerchiefs, not sticks. We're civilized. And a Neapolitan queen who replaced the rosary beads with dried chickpeas so the poor could eat their prayers. But for now, let your own pulse slow to the cadence of clacking needles and distant wing beats. Let the scent of wet wool and evening air drift away, cool, sheepy, barely noticeable, like freedom when it arrives loop by loop, row by row. We'll drift onward when you're ready, no sudden crescendo, only the faint, persistent echo of mirrors learning to breathe along with you. Still floating. Lovely. Let's glide west one last gentle arc until the night air smells of meadow grass and the faint nuttiness of roasted chickpeas. First stop, the Abbey of Sion, Middlesex, English brick, Thames mist, and a perpetual hush broken only by swans hissing at shadows. Our hostess is Duchess Elena Percy, left widowed after her husband's Yorkist loyalties became suddenly unfashionable. The new regime suggested Sion as a place of sure tranquility. Elena arrived with one trunk of books and a half-forgotten childhood memory of Morris dancing at May fairs. The abbess permitted exercise in the cloister garden, provided it was seemly. Elena interpreted that as rhythmic walking with handkerchiefs, purely to keep the circulation flowing, of course. She taught the novices a simple step-hop pattern, white linen squares fluttering like moth wings at dusk. The chant was whispered, barely audible. Left, together, right, lift, thank the Lord for daily gift. No bells, no sticks, nothing unseemly, just the soft swish of fabric and the occasional stifled giggle when someone landed off beat. Pilgrims peering over the garden wall saw what looked like slow-motion prayer flags and reported visions of angelic semaphore. The abbess, noticing improved posture and fewer fainting spells during long offices, allowed the practice to continue provided it stayed below the volume of one breath per step. Elena died at 58. Her gravestone reads simply, "She kept time, gently." If you wander Sion at twilight, you may glimpse white scraps of fabric tied to the rosemary hedge, modern visitors mimicking the dance, unaware they're completing a 5-century-long circle of seemly rebellion. Let's drift south now to Naples, to the cloister of Santa Chiara, where Queen Sancha, wife of the intermittently sane Robert the Wise, was encouraged to retire after politics turned Borgia-flavored. Sancha arrived with pockets full of dried chickpeas, reasoning that if prayer feeds the soul, the body might as well tag along. She replaced the ivory rosary beads with chickpeas, one per prayer, and encouraged the poor who lined the cloister grill to swap a decade of aves for a handful of protein. The practice became known as eating one's paternosters, which confused visiting clerics who took it literally and complained of theological indigestion. Sancha also instituted communal roasting on Fridays, the scent of warm legumes drifting through the grills like incense for the hungry. Novices claimed the chickpeas tasted of mercy. The cellarer noted they reduced the lentil budget by a third. When Sancha died at 61, her rosary, now a string of hollow, chewed husks, was buried with her. The poor kept the tradition for decades, threading their own prayers on legumes, roasting the daylights out of them, and leaving the shells in small piles outside the cloister as edible thank-you notes. If you visit Santa Chiara at dawn, you may still find a single chickpea balanced on the windowsill, chalky and hopeful, waiting for someone hungry enough to pray. Feel the tempo settle into its final hush, the soft pad of cloth shod feet on damp earth, the faint pop of roasting pulses, both quieter than a yawn yet oddly sustaining. These women fold the edges of captivity until the crease resembles sustenance, something you can chew or wave or simply breathe along with. And now, let's allow the stories themselves to slow, like a spindle running out of thread. Imagine all the abbey gates we've passed. Danish wool, Sicilian saffron, Bavarian mirrors, swinging gently shut behind us, not with a clang but with the sigh of old wood settling back into its frame. Inside, the ex-queens keep humming, stitching, roasting, dancing, each at her own low wattage, each convinced she is doing nothing important at all. Yet the walls remember. They hold the faint salt of tears that tasted like cardamom, the ghost green splash of salsa on sacristy stone, the apricot blush of habits long faded to cream. And they hold your footsteps now, soft visitor who never once demanded a throne, only a story quiet enough to sleep beside. So let's leave them there, knitting tunnels that stretch nowhere, teaching geese to count time, trading prayers for chickpeas, making small, ridiculous, luminous adjustments to the business of being told where to stand. Their crowns are gone, their names are footnotes, their rebellions fit comfortably inside one slow breath. And if tonight you hear a distant goose honk in near-perfect meter, or catch the whiff of saffron where no saffron should be, or find a single chickpea in your coat pocket, blame the breeze, blame memory, blame the soft machinery of history learning to whisper instead of shout. Close your eyes now. The cloister bell is imaginary, but it tolls all the same, once for every woman who turned a lark into a mirror into a window into an exit too gentle to notice. Sleep. The gate is shut, the yarn is wound, the chickpeas are cooling on the sill. And the crown, well, the crown learned to rust in silence a long, long time ago.